On the high ground around the Somme village of Beaumont-Hamel, Hawthorn Ridge dominates the landscape both in the modern world and the world of the Great War. In this episode, we walk that battlefield from Hawthorn Ridge to the Sunken Lane. In the second of our recordings made on the battlefields of the Western Front, we're back on the Somme in the ground around the village of Beaumont-Hamel and walking between Hawthorn Ridge and the Sunken Lane. We've had a lot about Hawthorn Ridge this month with the Old Front Line, with the first of our vlogs, our video podcasts on YouTube. And that's a visual way to tell the story, and this is the more traditional podcast way to do it. There is some crossover between those two formats, but I think that this is quite a good way to talk about this subject, and through the podcast probably spend a bit more time thinking about different themes connected to these places that we walk when we walk the battlefields of the Great War and how they strike us. I think that's one of the things that I've learned through doing this approach. By recording some material actually on the ground itself, I can stop and I can think about the history and give you my thoughts on that ground as we're there. And that's something that I'm going to do more of as we go forward. I think it shows too that no matter how many times you've walked or been over or visited a particular location on the Old Front Line, it's still somehow never enough. I mean, I have no idea how many times I've been to Hawthorn Ridge since I first went there in the mid-1980s, how many times I've stood at Eric Heaton's grave, how many times I've walked round the Hawthorn Crater or gone into the Sunken Lane. But every time there is something different, something fresh, a perspective, something that I've read recently or something I've thought about, a memory of a chat with a veteran or a page in a diary or a letter. It comes back and I look at the grounds afresh once more. And I think that's important in all of our visits to these battlefields. Many would ask, why do we go again and again? And I think there are many reasons for that, reasons that perhaps we can't always explain to others who have never been there. When we think about the veterans of the Great War and how difficult it was for them to verbalise their experiences and trying to explain the context of what they'd seen to those who'd never seen it. We haven't fought that war, of course, but we've trudged that ground and we've connected to it, and it means something to us. And I think that just as with their war experience, we can't always convey what this landscape of the Great War means to those of us who are compelled, who are influenced, who are drawn to that landscape. How do we explain what that means to us? And I think it's the value of returning as often as you can to pause and think and reflect. And that's what we'll do now as we walk that ground around Beaumont-Hamel. It's dawn on the Old Front Line, and we're coming towards the end of our week of walking these battlefields of the Somme. And I'm in the village of Carnoy, village just behind the British front line, for the months leading up to the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And just in the valley behind the village is Carnoy British Cemetery, where Billy Neville, who kicked his footballs into battle with his men on the 1st of July 1916, the 8th East Surrey Regiment, is buried. But I'm looking towards the rising sun coming up over a long finger of woodland that stretches from just to the east of Carnoy up towards Montauban, the next village. And the far end of that woodland, the Talus Boisé, was where the front line was located. First the French in 1914 and early 15, and then British troops from the summer of 1915 onwards marched along the the road in front of our little cottage we're staying in here, rebuilt in the 1920s in that typical 20s Piccadilly building style. But the little road in front, the layout of this village is pretty much the same as it was more than a century ago, and the men marched down that lane, and I can see the morning sun catching some of the puddles in the cart track that heads out towards that part of the battlefields. It's evocative to be here with birdsong around us. We've had birdsong all week with skylarks and chiffchaffs, and we've seen a huge amount of the natural world intermingling with the history of the Great War and the landscape of the Western Front. And today we're finishing off by heading up to the area around Beaumont-Hamel, and I'll be walking that later this morning. But starting here, a little bit of quiet in the morning to pause and think about so many men, so many stories, so much history that passed through villages and places like this in those years of the Great War. I've walked this morning from near to the village of Auchanville, Ocean Villas, to the soldiers in 1916, up the track onto the Hawthorn Ridge. Now, this is a part of the battlefield that we've covered in the podcast before, but I've never recorded anything on site, as it were. And for me, if it's the right word to use, this is one of my favourite places, one of my perhaps most connected places that I have on the Somme battlefield in the way that I connect to it. In the 1980s, I became fascinated with this battle around Beaumont-Hamel, both at the beginning and at the end of the Battle of the Somme. And I researched it back in the days, pre-internet days, as they're very difficult to believe they ever existed sometimes, but when you had to do kind of manual research at the archives, looking through the pages of actual war diaries, often plastered with mud, and maps with pencil markings on them made by the men who were there, and then research in local libraries to try and track down the families of the soldiers, the casualties that you came across when you visited places like this. And I came up here to where I'm sitting now in Hawthorn Ridge No. 1 Cemetery. It's a small battlefield cemetery out in the fields, and today I pretty much have this landscape to myself. There's no other visitors around me. I can't see a car. I can't even hear a car. I can hear crows in the trees of the neighbouring Newfoundland Park, where the Newfoundland Regiment fought on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, amongst others. And now it's a memorial site to those Newfoundland soldiers who died there in 1916. I can hear some skylarks in the distance, but I pretty much have this landscape to myself. And I think that is one of the great things about visiting battlefields of the Great War and how we connect to them, is that you can have this landscape seemingly to yourself, but never quite to yourself, of course, because I'm sitting here in a British and Commonwealth cemetery from the Great War, surrounded by headstones of soldiers who fell here at the two ends of the Battle of the Somme, and a handful, from 1918 when the fighting returned here. So it feels as if you're never quite alone because of that, because on these headstones are the names of those soldiers. There are unknowns here as well, but perhaps they stand beside us when we visit. I mean, who knows? But there is certainly a presence here in so many ways, on so many levels. And I've connected to this really because I've researched it and tried to understand it. I travelled to the German archives in Stuttgart to look at the German side of this battle. The 119th Reserve Infantry Regiment defended the trenches that were just sited just behind me where I'm sitting now, on the base of the Cross of Sacrifice in this cemetery. And they were here from the end of 1914 right up to the end of the Battle of the Somme. And their archives in Stuttgart shined new light for me on the story of what unfolded here on that first day of the Battle of the Somme. But in those days when I used to come to the cemeteries, and I still do this today, I went to a couple of cemeteries this week which I'd never visited before, and it's always good to get the cemetery register out as you walk around to look up some of the names that you find. And when I came here, it's a relatively small cemetery. You can just wander up and down the headstones very quickly and pick out interesting inscriptions and unusual regiments and perhaps unusual names as well. And when I got to the end of one of the rows, I saw something on a grave, and that kind of drew my eye to it. But I looked at the name, E.R. Heaton, and then got the register out and looked it up. He's Eric Rupert Heaton. And I noted that his next of kin were living in Hove in Sussex. His father was a vicar there. Now, I knew that Heaton was not a very common name in Sussex, being a Sussex boy myself. So when I got home, I looked that name up in the phone books, in those, again, pre-internet days when there were phone books in every local library. And I found 3 Heatons. One I wrote to and never replied. One I wrote to and wrote back and said, I'm not a relation, but good luck. And the third one I wrote to, she did write back, and she said, I'm Irene Heaton, Eric's brother, and please have this picture of him, this postcard photograph of him that was taken before he went to France in 1916. And that immediately connected me really to Eric Heaton's story. And I went to visit her a few times. She lived in a big house in Hove, and she lived in a big room of that house, which was like a shrine to him, with photographs of him on the wall. There was his memorial plaque, his memorial scroll. She had all of his letters. She had even a lock of his hair. And she'd really lived in the shadow of his loss. The whole family had, in some ways. But I traced her, of course, because her name was still Heaton. She'd never married. And she was a middle-class young woman in the 1920s, and a lot of middle-class young men had been killed in the Great War, or terribly injured and disfigured, and perhaps never would marry themselves because of that. The tragedy of the Great War just seemed to go on and on. But I asked her, she had photographs of herself at that time, and she was an incredibly beautiful young woman. And I said, being in my 20s, being a bit cheekier as I was then, and perhaps not quite so shy of asking these kind of questions, I said, how come you never married? And she said, well, there were not a lot of young men of my class that had survived one way or another the Great War, but more than that, I felt that Eric, to me, was the epitome of what young men should be, and that no man would ever live up to that, so she never married. And as I've said many times, I often feel that the women of the Great War, not just those who served, and there were thousands of women who served in one or other capacity, whether in munitions factories on the home front, or doing vital war work, or replacing men in jobs on the home front, or serving overseas in nursing, or in the Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps, or whatever it was. But there were the women who had to deal with the tragedy, the losses of the Great War, the mothers and the sisters and the daughters, who, in my mind, will always be as much casualties of the Great War as the men that they lost. And with that loss, the soldier, his life ended in places like the Somme, where I'm sitting now. But for them who lived long lives, and Irene Heaton lived well into her 80s, they spent decades really coming to terms with what that loss was and how it changed them, and changed them it certainly did. And those are the things I think that when we come to these cemeteries, the value of these cemeteries, it's not just, lest we forget, visit the headstones, the heroes, whatever words we're going to use. And some of those words sometimes I do find uncomfortable, because the reality of death on a battlefield is not heroic. But I think it doesn't just connect us to the dead. It's easy to think that, and easy to believe it, and perhaps easy to come here and think that everyone died because there are so many cemeteries, but most men survived. And it's the families who had to deal with this as well, as we've said. And all of that seems to come together. We often talk about these crisscross paths of the Great War, and it feels very strong for me when you come to a place like this beacon of the Great War on this vast open landscape here on the fields in front of Beaumont-Hamel. The crisscross paths come through these graves, not just Eric's grave, because he's a story that I know in here. When I look along these rows of headstones that are in here, there are many other stories, but we don't always have them documented, certainly not in the way that we have it with Eric. And one of the things that Irene Heaton had, that she gave me a copy of, was his last letter home from the trenches. And this was the letter that would be read in the event of his death. It was written, I'm looking now across the headstones towards the church spire of Auchanvillers, Ocean Villas, and that's where he wrote it on the eve of the Battle of the Somme. And this is that letter. My darling mother and father, I am writing this on the eve of my first action. Tomorrow we go to the attack in the greatest battle the British Army has ever fought. I cannot quite express my feelings on this night, and I cannot tell if it's God's will that I shall come through. but if I fall in battle, then I have no regrets save for my loved ones I leave behind. It is a great cause, and I came out willingly to serve my king and country. No one had such parents as you have been to me, giving me such splendid opportunities, and always thinking of my welfare at great self-sacrifice to yourselves. This life abroad has taught me many things, chiefly the fine character of the British race to put up with hardship with wonderful cheerfulness. If I fall, do not let things be black for you. Be cheerful, and you will be living life always to my memory. I thank God for my brother and sisters, who have all been very much to me. Well, I cannot write more now. You are all in my thoughts as I enter this first battle. May God go with me. With my love to you all, always, your loving son, Eric. And he fell just a few days later, on the 1st of July, aged 20. He had aspirations to follow his brother, who was an army chaplain, and his father into the priesthood, to go across the world spreading the message of religion, of God, and who knows what else he would have gone on to do. But his life was cut short here. He was killed leading his men up the slopes of the ridge. I'm looking down now towards the White City, where the battalion assembled before they made the attack up here. And Eric led his men up the slopes of that hill. It was waist-high grass in no man's land, and he was last seen hit in the legs, dropping into the grass. His fate after that was unknown. And the family hoped beyond hope that somehow he'd survived, that he'd been picked up by the Germans, had lost his memory, maybe languishing in a hospital somewhere, but he'd been killed here on the 1st of July, and his body laid here until the battle moved on in the winter of 1916-17, and this ground was cleared. And the dead who were buried around me here now in Hawthorn No. 1 were brought in here for burial in essentially a comrade cemetery. It's a collective burial. And we see that with multiple names on the headstones, and one large headstone with a plain cross on it with no lettering, and that is in the middle of the plot, indicating that you're looking at a collective, not a mass grave, but a collective burial of men laid side by side. I mean, we won't dwell on the realities of human remains laying in the open for 4.5 months and then eventually being reburied, but I think you can imagine possibly the circumstances under which these men were recovered, what remained of them were recovered and then reburied here. And finally, for the Heatons, the telegram arrived saying that he had been killed in action, confirming his death, and they had to accept the terrible reality of that. But they had strong beliefs, strong Christian beliefs, and I think that helped many people through. For others, it saw a rejection of those beliefs, but for the Heatons, it helped them. And they came here just after the war in 1919, across these fields I'm looking over now, when this was just a wasteland. And they came here to visit his grave when these were crosses. And the parents stood behind the grave. Irene Heaton knelt as if in prayer behind him, and her brother, the army chaplain, took a photograph of them standing there, which I'll put on the podcast website. I've used before. I can never use it enough, and it's so great to see so many people sharing that image and using it when they come here and bring their friends or groups here. It's so important to see these images, for us to have a sense of what it meant to lose someone in a place like this. And you can see it in that picture. You can see it in the way that Irene has bowed her head, as I say, as if in prayer. Maybe she was in prayer. And they left behind a little plaque, and that plaque is there today. I'm looking out across to it now. It's been here more than a century now. And here it remains, not just as a memorial to Eric, but as a memento, as a shadow of that visit here in 1919, one family trudging across that landscape, that wilderness of the old front line to visit a simple cross in a soldier's cemetery on the Somme. I've walked now across the Hawthorn Ridge along the track that comes down from Hawthorn Ridge No. 1 cemetery round to the Hawthorn Mine Crater, and this is now maintained by a group. They have it on a 99 year lease. And it's interesting to compare it when I stand here now at the cleared end of the crater. You can see into it. You can see the size of what is in fact a double crater, kind of figure of 8 shape, with a mine blown here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and then one blown again at the end of the Somme on the 13th of November. So it's really 2 craters. But when I first came here in the 80s, visiting Eric Heaton's grave for the first time, this was full of trees, and you had no sense that it was a crater, no sense of its size, no sense of the destruction that it had caused in 1916. And it was remained like that really for many, many decades, until the Hawthorn Crater group came along and they have cleared this site, opened it up, and given us the views that we have now. And I mean, all credit to them, because it really, really exposes this site. It has removed the obstacles to what we see here. It has opened it up and has increased our understanding of it. And it's one of the positive things, I think, that has come out of the post-centenary period. And it's good to see people working together like this to make an important part of the Western Front, the Somme landscape, more accessible to visitors today. This was a mine filmed, and I'm looking now round to the far end of the valley just ahead of us, and there's an escarpment there with a little water pumping station, and that's where Geoffrey Malins was with his camera, and Baby Brooks, the photographer, Lieutenant Brooks, photographing it, and Malins filming it from that point with the mine going off. Those classic images of the Great War, not just of the Battle of the Somme, with the hillside erupting as the mine went off. And here we are standing on the lip of the crater of that mine. So it's always something to really come here and see this. And I think now, as I say, when I first came here, a lot of people kind of look back to that period 4 or more decades ago as some kind of golden age. But places like this were under threat. There was fear that this was going to be filled in at one stage, and that didn't happen, thankfully. And now its future is pretty much secured, and that's a good thing. And again, it's still, although the trees have been cleared, I just heard some chiff-chaffs when I first arrived. There was a skylark following me down the track, and I can see some chaffinches, I think, in the background there. So it's again very much part of the natural landscape as well as the Great War landscape, and I think that is important. These things have to coexist with everything around them, the natural world and the French population that live here. And I think as many French visitors now come up to these sites, possibly as British, although it's a pretty busy period at the moment. I can see a couple of cars down in the Sunken lane, and that's where I'm going to head down to fairly shortly to look at the story of what happened there. But a place, as I look now into this massive area of open ground blasted away by those tens of thousands of pounds of ammonite explosive, a tunnel and a mine dug and placed here by men of the 252nd Tunnelling Company of the Royal Engineers in the months leading up to the Battle of the Somme. And when we look at the air photographs, it only kind of bit the nose off of the Hawthorn redoubt that was placed here. So it probably only killed between 20 and 30 German soldiers. I say only, but it killed that many, not hundreds, which is what I guess they hoped might have happened. So when the men of the Royal Fusiliers emerged from the trenches, I'm looking back now across the open fields beyond the wooded edge of the crater towards Ocean Villas, where the British front line was, and an advanced company of the Royal Fusiliers moved up to occupy this side of the crater where I'm standing now, and immediately opened fire and came into contact with the Germans on the other side of the crater. The bulk of the German troops were in their second line position, more towards Beaumont-Hamel, whose spire I can see just through the trees there, and they emerged with their rifle and machine gun teams, and the battle began here. And when the rest of the rest of the battalion and the rest of the division moved out of the trenches behind, they came under this withering machine gun fire and shell fire as the flares went up, indicating the necessity for a barrage to drop down onto no man's land. German shells hit the attacking waves and gradually these battalion after battalion here, melted away under this fire. And in the whole division that attacked in front of Beaumont-Hamel, 29th Division that served at Gallipoli the previous year, they had over 5,500 casualties here on the first day of the Somme, and nothing to show for it. The redoubt was damaged but not destroyed. The crater remained in German hands. The Germans fortified it, and was only taken at the end of the battle by the 51st Highland Division when the mine was reused, with tunnels reused of that mine, and another charge was blown, making this figure of 8 kind of style of crater, which you can see very clearly from the air. And even when you stand here now, you can see it's not like Spanbroek Molen in Flanders or Lochnagar down the road. It's not a perfect circle. It's 2 craters merged together. So a place to come to think, contemplate and remember what happened here over a century ago. And one of the great things about walking this ground, you can just walk from the tracks around Ocean Villas and up to the Hawthorn Ridge Cemetery, and then along the lane and into this important crater site, and then down the hill to the Sunken Lane, and the cemetery's there. And that's where I'm going next. I've walked down off of the Hawthorn Redoubt and the Hawthorn Ridge area down into the valley between Ocean Villas and Beaumont-Hamel, Ocean Villas and Beaumont-Hamel, and I've come into the Sunken Lane, probably one of the most visited parts of this area of the Somme battlefields. There was a coach group here earlier. I met Mark and Anna. Mark's podcast listener. It's great to bump into podcast listeners when we're out and about on the battlefields. And I've got it to myself now. It's quiet, apart from the birds, and I'm sheltered from the wind here. And a sunken lane, I mean, we often refer to this as the sunken lane, but sunken lanes are very much part of a chalk downland landscape. Walking the South Downs in Sussex in my youth, this was very much part of that landscape, a landscape familiar to me. I think one of the reasons why I've always felt so at home on the Somme is the similarity between this chalkland and the chalk downlands of Sussex. But yesterday I was walking a sunken lane at Gerdecourt, for example, so this isn't the only one, there's many of them, but this one became famous, of course, because of what happened here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And originally, when the British took over this sector from the French in 1915, regular soldiers of the British 4th Division moved up here from Ypres, having just taken part in the Second Battle of Ypres. And compared to the gas attack and the tremendous fighting that they were involved in there, this must have seemed a very quiet sector to them. And the Sunken Lane was in no man's land between their forward positions and the German positions on the edge of Beaumont-Hamel that straddled an area of woodland. But as the Battle of the Somme loomed close and they began to make plans for this, to dig the tunnel, to lay the charge of the Hawthorn mine that would blow the Hawthorn Redoubt, enable the attack to proceed there, they also looked at this, and the same tunnellers that had been involved in the construction of the mine were detailed to dig a tunnel from the British front line into this sunken lane. And in the winter months and the spring, just about see it today, there's an indentation in the bank of the sunken lane. I'm looking down towards the ridge now, and on the right hand side there's a indentation. That's where the tunnel came out. And on the eve of the Battle of the Somme, the men of the 1st Battalion Lancashire Fusiliers had moved into this. This was a battalion that had fought at Gallipoli, won an incredible number of Victoria Cross before breakfast, as the saying goes, in the Landys at Gallipoli the previous year. They moved into this lane through that tunnel. It wasn't just them. There were men from the Brigade Trench Mortar Battery and the Brigade Machine Gun Company. And with them as well was Geoffrey Malins, the cinematographer, and he filmed them in the early hours of the 1st of July when the light came up and there was enough light for him to film. He could film them tucked against the left-hand side of the bank. So again, I'm standing here looking down the sunken lane towards Hawthorn Ridge, and on the left-hand side of the lane is where these men were tucked up against this. And there's incredible footage of this that he took, which was digitised and cleaned and colourised by Peter Jackson in that centenary film that was made using that footage particularly from the Battle of the Somme. And they're looking back at the camera, and you can see the weapons, you can see some trench mortars, you can see the riflemen from the infantry platoons and the Lancashire Fusiliers. And although many of these men may well have been in action at Gallipoli, this probably to them seems something much bigger than that. And Malins having filmed his sequence of film here, went back through that tunnel to set up in that embankment area to eventually shoot the film of the mine exploding at 7:20 a.m. And then they posted some military policemen at the entrance to the tunnel, and no one could go back. And at 0 hour, half of the Lancashire Fusiliers were in here, the other half were in their original front line. And the idea of the annexation of this Sunken Lane was to give them a jumping off point where they could advance from here towards the German positions. And they were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Magniac, the Maniac, his men called him, a very brave officer. And he led his men over the top from here into that withering fire that opened up almost as soon as they left the cover of this lane. And within just tens of yards of its safety, of its cover, moving out into the open ground beyond the lane, within tens of yards, the battalion lost well over 400 men. Colonel Magniac, the Maniac, he was awarded a Distinguished Service Order for his bravery here in trying to take his battalion forward, and he would lose his life. He was killed at Arras the following year. I mean, you can hear the birds in the background. It's a very tranquil place now. After the 1st of July, it was properly annexed. The trench was dug along the lip, if you like, of the Sunken Lane. 252 tunnelling company that had dug the tunnel into it and had dug the Hawthorn mine. They then put in some very deep dugouts, the entrances to which were exposed a few years ago, and the field is always under threat of collapse just beyond it, which I think is why the farmer has kind of put it as set aside now. But it remains a very poignant place to come to, because it is almost as if time has stood still here. The Sunken Lane looks hardly different to the film that Malins took here on the 1st of July, and you can reach out and touch history here. I think that is what brings us back to these places, is what connects us to the history of the Great War when we come here. But in places like this where the past doesn't seem that far away, we can stand here in our mind's eye, see the flickering of that film from 1916 and the faces, the anxious faces looking back at the camera. A moment in time, and in many cases, by nightfall, those men were dead or wounded, and may well lie in Beaumont-Hamel British Cemetery, just around the corner, and that's where I'll head next. I've walked round to Beaumont-Hamel British Cemetery. This sits in the old no man's land between the Sunken Lane, which became an extension of the British front line here on the first day of the Somme, and the German positions that were on the edge of the woodland just across to my right from where I'm sitting, just sitting tucked away behind the cross of sacrifices. It's still quite windy, and I want to reduce the kind of wind noise in the background of recording this, but it's created a little quiet haven for me. I can just hear some tractors on the road. There's a group just turned up in the Sunken Lane to hear about the history of the Great War here, and I've come round to the cemetery. And on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the men of the Lancashire Fusiliers emerged from that lane just across to my left from where I am now, and they moved out into this open ground, came under withering machine gun fire from the German positions on the edge of that wood, but probably also enfilade fire, machine gun fire coming in from their flanks from German positions around the Hawthorn Redoubt as well. And very quickly those advance parties, the Lancashire Fusiliers, supported by machine gunners and by trench mortar men, withered away under that. And probably where I'm sitting now, where this cemetery is located, is about as far as most of them ever got on that first day of the Battle of the Somme. And the Sunken Lane then became the new front line, and that remained the front line until the Jocks, the Highland Division, attacked at the end of the Battle of the Somme in November of 1916. And when the Somme campaign ended, and it went into that cold winter of 1916-17 when temperatures in the frontline areas around here, around Beaumont-Hamel, which by then had been captured, and the new front lines were beyond that towards Munich Trench and Wagon Road and up towards Serre, which is just over the rise, just ahead of me there. Units bivouacked in the old no man's land here, and one of those that bivouacked, and there are some men from that battalion buried in here, was the 2nd Battalion, the Manchester Regiment, and one of their newly joined officers was 2nd Lieutenant Wilfred Owen, the war poet. This was the first sector of the Western Front where he served as a platoon commander in that cold winter of 1916-17, which led eventually to some of his classic Great War poems like Exposure, where he talks about just how cold and shriveled and frozen winter in the trenches were just during that period of the end, the fag end, the tail end of the Battle of the Somme. And for the men here on the ground, I mean, we know now, we can look back thanks to the Battles Nomenclature Committee and the division of the war and into this battle and that battle. I think at the time that division would not have been as apparent to these men, and this would just have felt like a continuation of what had taken place here in 1916. But it's strange to think of Owen camped in these fields, his great war only just beginning, and his path to destiny, it's almost at its very end, ever drawing near, ever there on the horizon. But of course, these are fields full of so many stories, and when you come to the cemetery and you look at the dates dominated in this cemetery, in this burial ground, by the 1st of July 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, you know, you can pick out so many stories of men who were here. It makes those names lift from the stone, visualise them. We can find their photographs in rolls of honour, in newspapers. We can search for their biographies. We can read their letters and hear the effect, just like Eric Heaton, the effect that it had on families. And I think that's when we move into another level, another dimension of the Great War, our understanding of the Great War, our knowledge and our appreciation and our connection to those ordinary men in these extraordinary circumstances of what took place here on the Western Front. And those are the kind of things that you think of, I think, when you travel and walk to places like this.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somme. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.